Peterson is part of the counterculture, but he describes himself as a classic liberal, and yet he's frequently described as right-wing by the media. This is not limited to Peterson. James Damore's infamous Google memo was described everywhere as an anti-diversity screed, despite him specifically stating he wanted to encourage more diversity in the workplace. Many believe that the Channel 4 interview was a significant moment in exposing this mindset as dogmatic, reactionary, and fixed.
So during the interview, we see an example of a delusional framework that is what appears to be largely incapable of perceiving and reacting to reality in real time. But much more interesting is what happened afterwards, which was the sort of the self-healing and policing mechanism of the larger social consensus of how the Blue Church reactively goes about maintaining the integrity of its frame. And so what ended up happening was there was a break in the frame, there was a glitch in the matrix, the mechanisms of the Blue Church reacted to endeavor to control the frame and to convert it into a way of making sense of what occurred that still maintained the integrity of its frame.
Do you mean when they tried to characterize it as sort of abusive trolls and the alt-right hero and all of that?
Exactly. Exactly. It's sort of a, to use a military language, it was a fallback position that was a reactive, almost instinctual, and not almost, in fact, precisely instinctual. It was a pure habit. There was no thoughtfulness or even strategic action there. It was if X, then Y. And in this case, Y is here's a set of things that one does to reestablish the dominant frame. And now we're 2 levels deep. The first level was a sort of self-evident disaster, but then the second level was also a relatively self-evident disaster. And there isn't really a third level in this approach. So what ends up happening, and this is, again, we can kind of just think about this from ordinary psychology. This is how delusions fall apart. Try as we might, our desire to interpret reality to mean what we want it to mean, at the end of the day, will always be checked against what reality actually is. It may be some time. We're pretty good at making things up and pretending, but eventually reality is reality.
This isn't to say that Peterson is not controversial. He's saying things that challenge the most deeply held assumptions of the new establishment narrative.
I guess the other reason that people are on my case to some degree is because I have made a strong case, which I think is fully documented by the scientific literature, that there are intrinsic differences, say, between men and women. And I think the evidence in that, this is the thing that staggered me, is that no serious scientists have debated that for like 4 decades. That argument was done by the time I went to graduate school. Everyone knew that human beings were not a blank slate, that biological forces parameterized the way that we thought and felt and acted and valued. Everyone knew that. The fact that this has become somehow debatable again is just, especially because it's being done by legislative fiat, they're forcing it.
Part of Peterson's argument, based on years of psychological research, is that much of the political conflicts are due to trying to integrate the different political temperaments of men and women.
We were talking about the relative evolutionary roles of men and women. This is speculative, obviously. And because our research did indicate, it's tentative research so far, that the SJW sort of equality above all else philosophy is more prevalent among women. It's predicted by the personality factors that are more common among women. So agreeableness and high negative emotion, primarily agreeableness. But in addition, it's also predicted by being female. And so I've been thinking about that a lot because, well, men are bailing out of the humanities like mad, and pretty much out of the universities except for STEM. The women are moving in like mad, and they're also moving into the political sphere like mad. And this is new, right? We've never had this happen before, and we do not know what the significance of it is. It's only 50 years old. And so we were thinking about this, and so I don't know what you think about this proposition, but imagine that historically speaking, It's something like women were responsible for distribution and men were responsible for production. Something like that. And maybe that's only the case really in the tight confines of the immediate family, but that doesn't matter because that's most of the evolutionary landscape for human beings anyways. What the women did was make sure that everybody got enough. Okay, and that seems to me to be one of the things that's driving, at least in part, the SJW demand for equity and equality. It's like, let's make sure everybody has enough. It's like, well, look, fair enough, you know, I mean, you can't argue with that. But there's an antipathy between that and the reality of differential productivity, you know, because people really do differ in their productivity. I think that the SJW phenomena is different, and I think it is associated, at least in part, with the rise of women to political power. And we don't know what women are like when they have political power, because they've never had it. I mean, there's been queens, obviously, and that sort of thing. There's been female authority figures, and females have wielded far more power historically than feminists generally like to admit. But this is a different thing, and we don't know what a truly female political philosophy would be like. But it might be, especially if it's not been well examined and it isn't very sophisticated conceptually. It could easily be, well, let's make sure things are distributed equally. Well, yeah, but sorry, that's just not going to fly.
One of Peterson's main influences is the psychologist Carl Jung. Jung's psychology was built around the concept of the shadow, all the things about ourselves we don't want to accept. Our anger, negativity, unconscious judgments, and how we need to integrate all those disowned parts to grow. I'm convinced that's what's happening on a vast cultural level. Since leaving Channel 4 News, I've retrained as a counsellor and started leading personal growth workshops for men, and thought a lot about how these unconscious gender dynamics are playing out in the culture. One of the central concepts is Jung's idea of animus and anima possession, how we each have both an inner masculine and feminine essence. In a man, when he's unconsciously possessed by his feminine side, his anima, he becomes withdrawn, moody and reactive. And when a woman is possessed by her male side, the animus, she becomes aggressive and dominating. And how many women are pushed into that by the nature of the modern workplace. The Cathy Newman I know is warm, compassionate, a successful and talented journalist. None of this is criticism of her, just the role she was playing in the interview.
Life has been moving forward for 3.5 billion years, and it moves forward in these patterned manners, like the dominance hierarchy, for example. So let's call that the masculine archetype. It's part of the masculine archetype. In fact, Jung's proclamation was that the female representation of the male, so that's the animus, is the dominance hierarchy. It's the patriarchy. So that's the unconscious archetype, which I think is extremely interesting given what's happened, say, in the women's movement, because that's what's projected onto men. And it can be projected in a very negative way. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. And so an animus-possessed woman treats a man as if he's the manifestation of the tyrannical patriarchy. He's a group. He's the group of men. Yeah, the group of bad men, actually.